Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Stuart Cohen from IGI Cyber Labs. We will get started in just a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for some people to be able to log into today's session. But before we get started, just be thinking about if you have any questions specifically about how CISA is delivering cyber hygiene services to help small businesses. And the flip side is if you're a small business leader or an MSP or MSSP supporting small businesses, what are some of the questions that you ought to be asking? What are some of the things you ought to be doing to provide assistance? And if you're a leader, what are the things that you ought to be asking your partners to get you if you're getting them from CISA or if you're getting them from a partner or from your internal team? As I said, we'll get started in just a second, but if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or the question box, and we'll make sure we get to them today. And then we will post the recording as well on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days and give you the contact information as well. We're just waiting for a few more people to log in, and then we will go ahead and get started. So thank you for joining us today. My name is Stuart Cohen from IGI Cyber Labs. As always, these are what we refer to as public service announcement education. This is not about, our product or our services or anything we do. These were designed and suggested by the Nodeware Advisory Council, folks on our website who are helping us, get the word out about what's happening with vulnerability management, what's happening with small businesses with all of the compliance requirements coming their way and the attacks that are so frequent these days. What can small businesses do? What can MSPs and MSSPs do to support those leaders? So the leaders of those businesses can focus on what they do, which is growing their business, delighting their customers, and becoming effective and efficient, profitable organizations, and at the same time make sure their critical data is safe and secure. If you have any questions, please put them into the chat box, and we will get to your questions today. Also, if you don't want to ask your question today and you want to submit them on our LinkedIn events page, you can do that. We're very interested in collaborating, having conversations amongst your peers. We've got a good group of people that are engaged in that activity at LinkedIn. So if that's something you're interested in, please do that as well. And as always, our recordings will be sent out after the event and we will post them as well. If I could just move on for a second to a couple of upcoming events. We're having a conversation with the National Cybersecurity Center in a couple of weeks, specifically around zero trust and the effects that zero trust is having, primarily on big businesses, but also as small business leaders are starting to think about the term zero trust and what does that mean. We've got a couple of people, including Gary McCallum, the retired Chief Security Officer at USAA, talking about zero trust and talking about continuous scanning and why continuous scanning is important to get to zero trust. That'll take place on the 18th. We also have what we do monthly, which is our Nodeware live demo and peer Q&A session. We recently had one last week with our partners from SOC Soda that provides SOC services to MSPs and to MSSPs, talking about what they do, how they do it, and the need for SOC services, either at the client level or at the MSP level. And then we have a series of sessions with Gradient, specifically around building out the MSP and MSSP ecosystem. We just did one on assessments where we had the president of Cybersecurity or Security Studio in talking about assessments, and we will have one in September specifically around cyber insurance, cyber liability for both the client organizations as well as for the MSP and MSSP organizations. So feel free to come to our website, go to our LinkedIn page to get connected to those as well. So with that, let's move on to today's session. We are fortunate enough to have Steve Mancini with us today. He is responsible for and works in the web application scanning area of CISA, and is here to talk to us today about the opportunities that CISA has put in place to help small business leaders, to help their IT teams, their security teams, or maybe they don't have an IT team or a security team, and there's one person that has responsibility for all aspects of that organization. So it's an opportunity to get your questions answered. It's also an opportunity to leverage some of the services that are available from CISA. Once again, as the market has changed dramatically with the number of frequency of attacks, as well as the number of compliance activities that are coming their way. So why don't I turn it over to Steve? He's going to talk about a couple of specific programs they have in place. We got some pre-submitted questions that came to us through your registration link, and then we'll get to any other questions you have online. So with that, Steve, thanks so much for coming to us today, spending a few minutes with us, and we really look forward to your insights.
Awesome, thanks, Stuart. And again, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. As Stuart said, my name's Steve Mancini. I run the web application scanning service under the Cyber Hygiene program, and we're going to talk about the cyber hygiene services that are available to you at no cost. So I'll get into that in a little bit. But first, I kind of want to kick it off, and the focus here is on small business. But as somebody who's been doing this, has been in the security field, the IT field for decades, what you find is it is irrelevant of the size of your organization, because you're all being threatened. In a lot of cases, it's all the same threat, and the defensive measures are the same defensive measures, et cetera, et cetera. So with that being said, I've worked a lot with small businesses, and I understand some of the challenges. Back before I was in DHS, I was a CTO of a small business, and so I understand the limitations and the challenges, whether it's funding, personnel, being in a location where maybe personnel aren't that readily available, et cetera, et cetera. But yet you've got to defend against the same attacks that, say, a large bank gets, but yet they've got a lot of money, or maybe they're in New York, or some place where they can easily recruit that high talent. So suffice to say, the challenges are out there, irrespective of whether you're larger or smaller. It does not matter. You have a lot of the same challenges. Approaches are going to be very similar, but again, the biggest differentiator between that is often resources. So to kind of kick us off, to get started with something CISA has been working on, is they've put together some guidance for small businesses. And Stuart is going to share the link with everyone, but you can see we're sharing the screen to kind of show you from the CISA page. And what this is, kind of back up, having been doing this for a long time, I will tell you the one challenge that a lot of organizations get is there is a lot of information, there is a lot of stuff out there, and I don't know where to start. Or I get a lot of threat reports, I don't know what to pay attention to. Or we've only got a small budget and I don't know where to begin. So these kind of best practices and recommendations are that kind of first step. Another thing I see is people are looking for an end game in cyber insecurity. The fact is, there is no end game. There's no, we've made it. You don't make it. It's just a day in, day out. Your business is constantly going to be targeted. You have something an adversary wants, whether it's PII, whether it's money, whether it's simply to use your infrastructure to launch, phishing attacks against other organizations, whatever it is. You have something that an adversary wants, and you have to protect that. So where do you begin? And again, these kinds of sites that we're from CISA out to small, medium businesses is meant to kind of say, hey, listen, start here. Don't try and boil the ocean. Just start here. Create a culture, put the pieces in place to get the ball moving. It's going to be a daily grind. So if we can scroll down the page a little bit, what we're introducing here is the different roles of the folks that you may or may not have in your organization. Look, a lot of folks, especially smaller organizations, may not have enough funding for, say, a CTO, a CIO, a CISO, and it might be the same person wearing that hat. But what you'll see is regardless of whether you have the funding for all of these different positions, the bottom line is the rules that they do, even if it's one person, 2 people, 12 people, should encompass a lot of this, whether it's training, whether it's creating policies, most importantly, whether it's creating a culture. And I'll kind of give you an example on the culture piece. So recently I completed my doctorate. My dissertation was about small businesses and the challenge they have for funding, cybersecurity, that famous buzzword from decades ago. Well, how do I secure myself? I'm a small organization and I don't have a lot of money. So I did research with a small organization that did not have a lot of funding and did not have a lot of personnel. But yet in the last several years, and this organization gets targeted quite frequently, they've never had a successful breach. So no one's ever actually gotten in. They've never been successfully attacked. No data's been stolen, et cetera, et cetera. Well, they don't have a lot of people and they don't have a lot of funding. How did they do that? Well, the end answer was they created a culture where everyone had buy-in to securing the organization. And to create that culture, that's all about leadership. That's not necessarily about funding. Yes, funding will follow leadership's priorities, but sometimes I simply don't have the money to buy everything I know I need to buy or invest in everything I need to invest. That's okay. You prioritize, you do your risk assessment. You say, what's most important and how do I defend that, et cetera, et cetera. But that all begins with having a culture, with having someone that says security is important and we're going to invest where we can and in what we can. But most importantly, I'm going to show the organization that security is important through my actions, through my words, and through my deeds, so that everyone in the organization buys in. And the result is people aren't just randomly clicking links. They're paying attention to what comes into their inbox. You're patching your systems, which doesn't cost a lot of money. We're running, local antivirus. We're doing these, what I call low-hanging fruit eliminators, which make the adversary have to work harder. And if you make the adversary have to work harder, you'll be fortunate if they say, this isn't worth the effort, I'm going to move on to someone else. And that's kind of where you want to be, because the reality is there are a lot of adversaries. They come from all over the world. They're inspired for a lot of different reasons, and they're going to constantly keep coming after organizations, small, medium, large, it doesn't matter. You want to make it as hard on them as possible. And of course, the reality is there's always somebody better than you. So your next thing is saying, well, listen, we want to make it as hard as we can. We want to have that organizational, attitude where people have bought into security, where they're paying attention, where they're trying to do the right things, and we're going to fight back. But if it does happen, I want my organization to be organized. I want to have the pieces in place to say, listen, can we find this quickly? Can we minimize the damage? Are we segmented? Again, these are best practices that have been around for decades. And so CISA is putting out these kind of, summarized things to do, things to pay attention to that'll kind of get you there. Don't try and do it in one day, because I don't know where to start. We'll start somewhere. And these are good resources to get you started. If we can scroll to the very bottom where it says additional resources, we're putting things out there. Don't try and do it all at one time. But there is a lot out there that you can start at and say, listen, am I doing, basic training? Are we doing basic package management? Are there people whose job it is to pay more attention? Have I created a culture where everyone's buying into this? Or are we just letting everyone click on every link, go to any website they want, and we don't care? You've got to take those simple steps to minimize the damage. And if you look at the site, and it's out there, and the link is out there, we're giving you additional resources. For example, the CSET tool is something you can go download and kind of assess yourself. It's not a technical pen test, a suite of tools, but it will ask you a lot of questions. And some of those questions might be as simple as, do you have an incident response plan? Yes or no. If you don't have one, you don't need anything elaborate. You just need something that says, hey, listen, if something bad happens, here's what we're going to do, and here's how we're going to do it. Bob's going to call Mary, and Mary's going to come in, and Jane's going to do this. And, have something so that you know what to do, so that if that something bad happens, you're not like, well, what do we do? I don't know. What do we do? So these resources kind of get you started there. Again, it's out there. You can always reach back to CISA. We put a lot of information, emails out there that if you say, listen, if you have questions, you can follow back up. to our, to our service support, and they'll gladly answer your questions. The next resource I will briefly talk about is ransomware. Again, we have a stop ransomware site, and obviously when adversaries get in, if they can encrypt your data, if you don't have backups and you don't have a way to recover your data, you might be forced to pay. And so here's a website that's built around saying, what do I do? Well, I'm going to tell you right now, you don't need to spend buku bucks to do something as simple as back up your data and keep it offline, even if it's a weekly backup. If you get popped by ransomware, and the worst case scenario is we lose a week's worth of data, well, that might be better than, hey, we're shut down for the next 3 months, we figure this thing out. So, they're just examples, that I'm throwing out there. But this is a good place to go and says, listen, ransomware is a big deal. There's a lot of things such as ransomware as a service, where bad guys can go out there and pay someone else to use their infrastructure to launch ransomware attacks. If you get hit by it, again, and you don't have backups and you can't recover your data, what are you going to do? I tell you right now, the government will tell you, don't pay the ransom. And I can tell you it's probably not a good idea to pay the ransom. Why? Well, 2 reasons. 1, there's no guarantee you're getting your data back. And 2, even if the adversary kindly gives you the key to decrypt your data, who says they won't come back? Who says they haven't already stolen your data? Who says they haven't left a back door just, to do something else? You're basically funding criminal behavior. So prevent it is the best mechanism. Be ready for it. This is a site that says, listen, start here, read through this. What are the low-hanging fruit that you can do now without thinking, listen, I don't have $20 million to spend in, advanced, third-party backups. Okay, what can you do now to minimize, 1, the probability or likelihood that you're going to get attacked, and then 2, if it does happen, how can I recover from this? What can I do? What are the best practices? What does the government say? Who's been seeing ransomware attacks, for at least 10 years? We've obviously have lessons learned working with private sector and other government entities that say, listen, this is the best way that these entities have gotten out of this jam, and this is what we recommend you do. So go take a look at the site, go see what it says. It's a place to start, and again, it's free resources. Last, and I'll spend a little more time on this, is cyber hygiene. So I suspect a few of you have probably signed up for cyber hygiene services. Again, it's a free service, and the idea is we're not trying to solve your woes, but we are trying to say is, look, I'm going to look at your external, landscape, if you will. I'm going to take a look. What I can see, an adversary can see. So we offer several services that kind of just give you a first look at, what do the walls around the castle look like? So I'll kind of start off with one that's been around a while, and that's vulnerability scanning. Vulnerability scanning, and for the record, we use commercial tools for everything we're doing. So for vulnerability scanning, we're using Tenable. And what we do is you provide us the IP addresses that you basically own. We will run something like, Nmap or whatever against the IP addresses to identify, what's up, what's an active host, and then what ports are open on that host. Then we'll feed that information into something like, Nessus, where we can then run Nessus against those IPs, against those active hosts, against those ports, and identify, what service is running on there, and based on that service, what it's vulnerable to. We're looking for basically CVEs. This is a weekly scan. However, if there's a critical, we will do what we'll call out-of-band scans. So let's say, for example, there's something like Log4j, and they say, oh my God, this is 10 out of 10 critical. It's going to shut the world down. We got to know who's running this thing. We will do a kind of a one-off scan specifically for that vulnerability. But typically the scans are done weekly against the IP range that you've given us. So we run it, we provide you a report every Monday, usually maybe by Tuesday at the worst case scenario, but usually Monday. You get a report and it says, listen, this is what we found. Here's the CVEs, here's the criticals, here's, we're using CVSS, I want to say 3, but don't quote me on that. But, we're out there using, the industry accepted standards for scoring. So we run this thing weekly and we're telling you, here's what we're seeing. If I see that, an adversary can easily run, a Nessus freeware or some other tool against your IP range and probably find the same things. And so if we're telling you, for example, you've got some highs out there, those are things you want to patch pretty quickly. The nice thing about the service is we're not mandating you do anything, but it would kind of beg the question, why sign up for a service that's telling you you're vulnerable and then you do nothing about it? Most of the stuff in the vulnerability scanning service is all about patching. So that's done weekly. Again, free service, runs continuously. You get your report every week. That is private sector. Hopefully you're reading it and paying attention to it. The next service is kind of one that we started about a year and a half ago, and that's what I run, and that's the web application scanning. It works very differently than vulnerability scanning. Number one, vulnerability scanning is looking at IP ranges. There are, especially in small organizations, a lot of them are, you're hosted by some third party where you don't own the IP range. So you say, well, I can't sign up for vulnerability scanning. We don't own the IP addresses. We're using third-party hosting providers. Got it. So, but you still have a website. You still have, maybe you have a payment site out there, whatever. Web application scanning works by, you give me your domains, www.mycompany.com, email.mycompany.com, bpn.mycompany.com, whatever. Give me your domains. You could also give me IP addresses that are hosting a web application. As long as there's a web, you give it to me. We scan it using Qualys. So we have Qualys Enterprise, and we scan it, and we do it monthly. And the reason we're doing it monthly is, unlike vulnerability scanning, web application scanning, these are CWEs. This is oftentimes application programming issues, which means more often than not, it's not a simple patch. Yes, there might be instances where you can patch things. Maybe there's libraries out there that says, hey, you're using an older library. You need to use 2.0 and you're still using 1.8. Got it. So there are some instances where you can patch, but oftentimes it's going to be code rewrites or tweaks, in which case you may not be doing that in a week. That might take weeks or months in some cases to rewrite sites, to rewrite pieces of code, test it, et cetera, et cetera. So we kind of agreed that, hey, monthly, seemed to make sense. So we run it monthly. Again, same thing. You get a report. Report tells you what we found. Take a look at the report. We're hoping you're fixing it. If you're private sector, we can't make you fix it. But again, why sign up for a service, find out you have vulnerabilities, and then kind of shrug your shoulders? It just wouldn't make sense. So hopefully you're fixing it. There's two other services that are not out. Go ahead.
See, before you move on, we did get a question about, so this service checks domain, web, email, DMARC, SPF. Could you just elaborate a little bit on what it checks?
Sure. Well, it's running against your web applications. So it's looking oftentimes for what I'll call kind of the top 10. Yes, it will pull things like, hey, if I find email addresses, or if I find, some kind of HTTP running and should be HTTPS, some kind of certificate stuff, it'll find that. But oftentimes it's looking, most likely what OWASP says are the things to be most concerned about with a web application. So for example, SQL injection, cross-site scripting, path traversal issues, stuff like that. But again, it will map out your infrastructure as best as it can and say, listen, I think you're running, Linux or Windows. I think you're running, IIS or Apache, whatever. So it will map out infrastructure as best as it can, and that's kind of a challenge with an unauthenticated scan, because the tools, when you're running unauthenticated schools, the tools are sending a packet, and based on the response, it's saying, hey, this kind of response is typically generated by this kind of operating system or this kind of application. So I think therefore you're running this. There are ways, or there are times when that's not quite accurate, or it might say, listen, I know you're running Windows, but I'm not sure if you're running, server 2012 or 2020, whatever. So when it's unauthenticated, it's making a best guess. But as far as what we're looking for, anything it can find infrastructure, and then mapping vulnerabilities, typically against CWEs and OWASP, most most common web application issues you're going to find out there. The reports are actually pretty thorough though, which hopefully
Hey,
doesn't scare people.
hey, Steve, one more question that we got asked is specifically around when you find a vulnerable device. I know we've seen this in the past where some vulnerable devices people, immediately put on on a hot list for remediation, but other devices, since they may not be connected to any critical data, they may identify them, they may map to them, they may tag them, but because they're not mapped to critical data, they're a low priority and maybe a low item to get to on the remediation list. Do you guys see things like that? Do you get questions about how do I put together an order for remediation?
So actually, it's a great question because we do get asked that. As far as prioritizing, like I keep it simple. I look at the findings and whatever tells me it's most likely a critical and it's real, not a false finding. I would always start there. But that's my 2 cents, having been a CTO. But to your point, now let's say I have 2 devices. One of them is not critical, but there's a critical finding on it. The other one is a critical device and there's a medium finding on it. That's where you do as an organization, you do your risk assessment. And there's a lot of factors that play into that. Look, it could take me 20 minutes to fix the critical finding on the low value asset. Why not just knock it out? Because even though that's a low value asset, it still might give an adversary a foothold into your network and realize, I can jump on a server, run a simple ARP command and say, hey, what else is connecting this server? And then use it to, do some kind of, traversal or lateral into another device. So even though you say, well, there's nothing on that device, yeah, but other things connecting to it by being on that device might allow me then to launch attacks from that device to another device. So, you have to always think lateral. Adversaries aren't going to stop. They're going to keep going to as many devices as they can. So, that's all about risk though. That's what you as the organization have to determine. Hey, listen, this thing's pretty segmented and it's just not that critical, but we have other priorities. Okay, that's your decision to make ultimately. You know your devices, you know your data better than I do. I'm giving you a report that says the tool says, here's your devices, here's what I think I can see, and here's what I think I found about them. Realize this, the tools aren't perfect. Sometimes the tools say something is low and it might be critical. Sometimes the tools say this is critical and it might not even be a vulnerability. So, we're kind of at the mercy of the tools, and then when you get that report done, that's your job is to say, let me look at this thing, let me look at these criticals, let me look at the devices and say, first of all, are these things real? Are they real vulnerabilities, or is the tool just misreading something? Is the device that's finding really critical? Is it not critical? Oh my God, if they got on this, they could actually do this. Again, that's what you as the organization who know your data and your network have to make those decisions. I can only tell you what I'm seeing from the outside looking in. But trust me when I say this, if I can see it, an adversary can see it. You've always got to keep that in mind, that when these services are provided to you, because we're not doing anything super secret, that means anybody can see this. So just always keep that in the back of your mind. Now, I will add one thing. With the web application scanning, we are just starting to roll out authenticated scans. And I mean, we are in beta. We did one on a private sector entity. They have a development system set up for us that mirrored their live system, so we could get to it, externally, just as if we were running a regular scan. They gave us some credentials, just to, kind of help us work out the kinks in our process, but also to run an authenticated scan, from Qualys against a mirror system of theirs. So we're slowly starting to roll that. And I'm going to tell you, when you run authenticated scans, the tools don't have to guess what the operating system is anymore, which means they can be a little more effective. It also means they can see things that they couldn't see. So, it's going to give us more insight into how, your network looks like. Again, I'm not trying to crawl around, some client, PC in accounting. We're still staying on, those web servers, most likely, hopefully, in your DMZ or on that third-party entity. Our goal is not to traverse internal to your network. So we're staying on those, on those devices that are hosting your web applications. But we're seeing behind the login page now when we do authenticated scans. So we're going to see a little more. So we're rolling that out slowly. If you happen to be a web application scanning customer and that is something that is of interest to you, shoot us an email and say, hey, I am interested. No promises on a timeline, because again, we have kinks and stuff we want to roll out. Again, we want to do this right. We don't want to just half-ass start scanning everyone and blasting credentials out there. So we're taking our time on this and trying to be very methodical about it. But if you are a web application scanning customer already, shoot us an email and say, hey, I heard you guys might be rolling out authenticated scans. We'll gladly follow up and talk about that.
Hey, Steve, to that point, one of the things that we've seen, and I'm curious from your perspective, when we provide Nodeware, we provide an unlimited number of free sensors and an unlimited number of agents to put on devices. And with the hybrid workforce, we have a lot of people that have a corporate device, but they're working from home. Where I would say pre-COVID, they might have had an agent on that laptop when they were working at home to make sure they could scan the laptop to make sure nothing vulnerable had gotten onto it. But now, with critical people, with critical corporate assets working from home, we now have people that are putting sensors on their home laptops or their corporate laptops from home to be able to scan their Wi-Fi to make sure that, somebody's, in an urban environment not getting on their Wi-Fi, or in a suburb not getting on their Wi-Fi, through an IoT device on their home Wi-Fi to get into their critical data. Are you guys seeing more and more of that? Because we're obviously not getting into the home networking security business, but it is interesting how many companies are asking their corporate devices that are being used from home to look at their home networks.
So great question. We're not looking, again, at the end clients. However, most likely they're going to be authenticating through some kind of application, and it's going to be on the DMZ. They're going to have to call to their DMZ, and it could be, and again, this is why I said, a lot of people think applications run on, port 80, 8080, 443. You do not need a domain to run a web application. And, authenticating and VPNs and APIs are perfect examples of that, where, you could be running on some server in your DMZ on port, 17,493, but it's an application that, to your point, either, clients are authenticating through, or maybe it's an API call, whatever it is. That is something we can look at, but we won't be able to look at the client that's connecting to it. Again, it would just be out of scope for what we're trying to do.
Got it.
But that is a good point, because I think a lot of people don't understand that when they're working from home, you think, well, I'm tunneling in. It's like, what do you think you're tunneling through to get in to the intranet? You're going through the internet to an external facing device, a server, an authentication server, running some obscure port, running, Cisco VPN or something. That is an application. And, those are things you want to patch and pay attention to, and not think my applications are www.mycompany.com. You got to think about what an application is. It is software running on a server, so, and that's why that's important when you're doing that inventory, that you understand, and this goes back to a best practice. It's not rocket science. When you're doing an asset inventory, what is my public facing presence? You can't see it as, it's my webmail, it's my payment processing, and it's our public site. It's anything I can get to on those obscure ports included that don't resolve through DNS because you have an IP that you're using to do this obscure authentication for your remote workers or for your API calls for data. So just things to think about when you're doing your asset inventories and when you're looking to maybe sign up for these servers, to ask us and say, hey, can you guys also look at this? We have a port 192.168.1, port 17,004 that runs an application for our API. Throw it on there. If it's running an application, we can scan it. Doesn't mean we're going to find anything. No, maybe we will, maybe we won't, but it's certainly something you want to at least acknowledge that's there to pay attention to and not forget about.
I just think, to that point, it's interesting. There are a lot of people that heard about, the thermostat on the fish tank at the Bellagio how they got hacked and how the ransomware attack came together. And now we have people coming to us and saying, boy, I wonder when I'm working at home on my corporate device, if my child, if my spouse, if my partner, brought some IoT device that we have on our Wi-Fi that we probably didn't do much with when we installed it. And I wonder if the bad guys can get in through that to my corporate device, into our network, to our critical data. And those are the questions we're getting asked, which was kind of outside the scope of what we ever thought about probably 12 months ago.
Right. No, that's a good point. Look, very simply put, if it's an external IP address or an external, application or web, it's accessible. So when you put that little doorbell up, okay, it's, maybe you got a doorbell in your house. Okay, it's connected to your local Wi-Fi. Got it. But there's still an application that you're accessing from your cell phone to get back in through your Wi-Fi. You're logging in from the internet into your internal network in your house through that application. So if that application gets compromised, whether it's your authentication credentials, whatever it is, then yeah, I'm getting into your your intranet. So I think people don't understand. They say, well, it's connected to Wi-Fi, but yeah, but how are you accessing it? Because that is probably public, and that's how I'm going to get in. I'm not going through the IP on the device itself, because it's probably a non-routable, internal IP. I get it, but if you're able to access that site through some web app, that's how I'm getting in. So yeah, that's a good point. I think a lot of people don't understand that because they think, it's connected to local Wi-Fi and it's a local IP address. Got it. But there's still a way to access that device externally, and it's most likely through the web. Good question, though. Good point. All right, two other cyber hygiene services that are not on this, kind of surprising here. That one is our phishing service. So we have a service basically where you can sign up and we'll work with your organization to basically phish you. It's not meant to go, aha, I gotcha. What it's actually meant to do is to help to get you what we'll call click rates, report rates. There is a little bit like, hey, is this thing, even dropping it, is actually making it to the, to the user, et cetera. But the bottom line is it's not about, aha, Jane clicked this link and now we're going to make fun of her. It's nothing to do with that. It's simply you as an organization can see, listen, I've got 23% of my users clicked on this, which should have been a very easy, Prince from Nigeria scheme. Uh-oh, we've got to improve our training. So the phishing is a good way, because as most folks know, the majority of compromises that are happening via phishing. Yes, there's good old-fashioned scan your network, find critical, hack in. Yep, that happens. But if you look at the overwhelming majority of major breaches, it's phishing attacks. A lot of the APT stuff, it's phishing attacks. BEC scams, phishing attacks. Romance, it's all phishing, phishing, phishing. So, the weakest link, unfortunately, is us humans. And so as a result, having some kind of training program, having mechanisms in place. And again, this goes back to the culture where you're encouraging your folks to say, listen, when in doubt, don't click on it. Pick up the phone, call someone, hey, did you send this? People think, BEC, business email compromise, is a perfect example. Billions of dollars have been lost through BEC scams. Why? Because somebody gets an email and says, listen, this is the boss. I'm on vacation in Mexico. I lost my wallet and I need you to wire me $10,000. And you think that's absurd. No one would do that. And I'm telling you, people don't only do that, they are doing it to the tune of billions and billions and billions of dollars have been lost over less than 10 years, because literally people are transferring funds based on emails. So the phishing is an important service. I know it's not on here, but again, you can shoot an email to the vulnerability box and say, listen, I'm interested. I heard about this phishing service, and you'll get information back on that. The force service, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because it's not open yet. It's only for government, but it is something we're slowly growing, and it's called posture and exposure. And the idea behind the service is to look at, as an organization, and I'll give you a good example. If I'm going to phish you, I want to learn something about you. So posture and exposure is a way of saying, what information can I glean about an organization that's out there? And it could be everything from, have email or have login credentials been compromised? Have emails been compromised? Is your organization being mentioned on the dark web? Is your IP addresses showing up in Shodan queries as super vulnerable? Whatever data feed. So they've got a whole bunch of different data sets that they kind of pull this data in. It's all open source stuff. Again, the power of open source cannot be underestimated. You don't need super secret skills to find out information on organizations. There's a lot of free information out there, and there's also a lot of information, through commercial, data sources. So the posture and exposure is the idea is, let's pull all of this data that we can find out about organizations and tell them, hey, listen, did you know that on the dark web, they're talking about you, and apparently credentials are for sale from your organization, and Shodan queries are showing up and saying, listen, your IPs have these exposed devices. So it gives them a sense of what they look like, from an adversary that might be doing their research on an organization. Right now, we're only doing that for government entities. At some point, we may open that up for private sector. If so, I have no idea when that will be, because again, this is going to be, thinking about what we're doing. This is a little more time intensive, but it's one of those things where you don't have to wait for the government. You can go out there and, just literally look up the word open source, and you'll find that there's all kinds of tools for open source and how to, gather information. And you can do simple queries and find out what's being said about my organization out there. What's being said about my C-levels? Are they being mentioned out there? Are there, whatever it is. So these are things, little baby steps that you can take and go find out about your posture. You can go out to Shodan and throw in your IP and see what will come back. You don't need the government to do a lot of this stuff for you. But this goes back to what I said before. But you need to know where to start. And that's why, go out to the small business. It starts with leadership, create that culture, identify things you want to focus on. Do not try and boil the ocean. Don't try and solve all of your woes in one day. Do a risk assessment. Say, let's start somewhere. And that start might be as simple as, listen, let's see if we can even identify what our external facing assets are. And then let's sign them up for these free services and see if we're vulnerable to some criticals. And at the same time, let's do some basic phishing for our employees. Start there. That right there would make a difference, because now your employees would say, some of them might literally say phishing, I've heard of it, but now they have a little appreciation. And now maybe your IT team's like, wow, we forgot all about it. We left that server on, or hey, we didn't realize we've got this old server running and it's got a bunch of criticals on it. Don't try and boil the ocean. Just identify some small steps that you can take, and then slowly just build from there. The resources out on CISA's website are a great place to start. Again, don't try and do it all at one time. You will get overwhelmed. Pick a couple of things. A good place to start is always your external assets. I mean, after all, you do not want to be hosting a website or some kind of server that's got a bunch of vulnerabilities that are 10 years old. You get popped every time a bad guy wants to try. He's going to walk right into your network. So start with your external facing assets. And first of all, can you even identify what you own? And what does it look like? Start there. And you don't have to spend a lot of money to do something like that. In fact, you shouldn't have to spend very much money at all to identify your own assets. But little things like that would be my advice as, again, as a former CTO, someone who works for the government now, is start with little things and build from there. With that being said, thank you for your time. I think we're going to open up for some questions, and I'm going to take a sip of water and go to mute. But Stuart, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, Steve, I appreciate all your time, all your insights. To your point, right? When I originally got started at IGI Cyber Labs, our intention was to provide vulnerability management scanning capability to organizations that had never done it before. And we're delivering it, through our partners at, well under, well under $1 per device per month. So it's certainly something that is very easy for people to understand what are the vulnerabilities they have, and what do they want to do about them. You know, which ones do they want to tag and map to get to later, and which ones do they want to prioritize now. So it's interesting how all that has evolved, and quite frankly, we're thankful for all the work that you guys have done at CISA and the things that you've provided. You know, one of the questions I wanted to ask you was specifically around, you know, something that's important to us, around continuous scanning. We've had a number of people that, you know, have used, you know, a service through CISA to get a monthly scan or to get a weekly scan, and now they've come to us and said, you know, we took advantage of the CISA program, but now we need continuous scanning during normal business hours because our clients or our customers are requiring that we do this, because they want to make sure their data is safe. And I'm wondering if you're seeing more and more of that, because of the frequency of attacks and the ability to know, you know, on an immediate basis when a new device shows up on your network or when a new vulnerability needs to be addressed.
So great question, and I'll tell you why. Not too long ago, I think the latest, and I'm sorry, Stuart, I'm going to make fun of vendors. The latest vendor buzzword has been attack surface management, and it is exactly what you're saying. The challenge with a lot of organizations is they don't necessarily know how often devices come online or go down. You know, and sometimes that's intentional, sometimes it's not intentional. Sometimes it's rogue IT staff. Sometimes it's, hey, when we did our weekly scan, these two servers happened to be offline for maintenance, therefore they didn't get scanned. So I want to have as real a time as possible in finding out what I have, and asset control is huge. What do I have? Because some things might not be, for whatever reason, up, available, weak internet connection, whatever it is, and you did a scan on Sunday night and it didn't show up. But Monday it's back online, everything's normal, but yeah, you just missed a weekly scan and now you got to wait another week. Well, there might be a critical that came out, you know, Sunday night, and now you're waiting a week to scan that to find out that you might be vulnerable to that critical. So we do not do the real-time scanning, and I think the biggest reason is, one is just the volume control. And we like, for example, our vulnerability scanning, we have over 4,000 customers. So weekly, it's kind of like that works. The web application scanning, like I explained, you know, we're trying to give you we're giving you time to fix it. However, the other side for our perspective is, you know, we don't want to throw a bunch of traffic at you, you know, or risk breaking something, especially during working hours. So I would never tell you, don't do real-time scanning. We just don't do it. But we have worked with some folks. In fact, when we were trying to work with some of our web app customers to do proactive identification, because what we found was customers were literally giving us a list of the web apps that they thought was the complete list. And so we worked with a vendor for a trial version for something for about 4 months, and we found a bunch of domains that they were like, oh crap. Some of them were dev sites, some of them were legitimate domains that they just forgot all about and didn't put them on the list. And so they weren't part of their regular scan cycle, but we proactively found them through a bunch of different mechanisms and said, listen, do you want us to add this? And they're like, heck yeah. In some cases, they literally took it offline. So I think there is a value in real time, especially for asset discovery. I think there's real-time value to say, listen, we want to keep running and making sure that when that scan happens, and let's just say you said, listen, we can only scan once a week because it's too heavy on the network and we don't want to risk breaking anything. Got it. But you at least want to do some kind of, you know, Steve's opinion as a former CTO, you want to do something that says, listen, I want to make sure that if it's not scanned, I want to know that it wasn't scanned because I know that I have it. And so constantly knowing what I have, there's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, there are tools, to your point, I know I'm drawing a blank, but there are some tools that literally put sensors, and when anything joins, or, you know, there's plenty of tools that something joins the network or drops off, it alerts you and says, hey, listen, you know, I can't talk to device XYZ or X the network, whatever. So there is that kind of real-time asset management stuff. So we don't do the real-time 24/7 for the reason I said, but I would tell you there is value in doing that. If for no other reason, asset control.
I think that's a great point. I will tell you, not to be disparaging to any of the vendors that have been in this space, but so many of them were built and designed years ago when Sunday night, when nobody was on the network, was an acceptable snapshot of the scan of your vulnerabilities. And that's all they did. And they can't, unfortunately, run during normal business hours because of the network degradation, because of the numbers of devices that drop and the problems that are caused. But in their defense, they were never designed to do that, which is one of the reasons why, a few years ago, IGI built Nodeware to support their consulting business at the time, and they were awarded a patent because of those normal business hour lack of network degradation and device problems. So it's interesting how the market has shifted because of the number of compliance requirements and the frequency of cyber attacks. As if we'd have been on this call a year ago, I would have told everybody in the audience that the only people who are going to use Nodeware are people who have never run a vulnerability management scan. And that was a big white space of opportunity, but it has changed dramatically where we have a lot of people and a lot of partners that use those traditional vendors for Sunday nights and quarterly and monthly scans, and they use Nodeware either when their clients demand, normal business hour vulnerability management scanning and alerting, and they're somewhat just trying to manage the marketplace for what's required. So, great points on that. Let's talk about assessments for a second. Do you guys offer anything as it relates to an assessment, and how does that work? And if you could just elaborate a little bit on that.
I will, but I want to real quick, and that goes back to my point, to your comments before, and that goes back to my point where people think cyber and security is an end state, and if I just run this scan, I've reached that end state, and it's like, no, your scan, that, to your point, it's not an end state to have run the scan, but too many people do have that mentality. And now, kind of transitioning to what you're saying as far as the assessments, there is a need for it because it definitely gives you, a good deep look. DHS does do some pen testing and assessments. I'll be very blunt. It's very hard to get them because it's in such high demand. We do things like remote pen test. We have other services where we will actually evaluate, network infrastructure, especially think like critical infrastructure protection programs, ICS. So they actually have services that offer that. In fact, if you go out to the CISA website, there is an entire catalog of services out there, and some of it is these assessments being both hands-on and just looking at architecture reviews. So there is a lot more in there, but obviously, again, being very blunt with everyone, like it's hard. You get in line because there's a lot of people that want those things. That's why we always kind of sell SciHy first. One, there's nothing to sell; it's free. But two, it can almost start right away, especially the volume scanning in the web app. The remote pen test, the architecture reviews and all that stuff, the VADERs, I think they're called. All of that is available. It's just a little longer wait list to get on there. But out on the CISA website, I believe there is a service catalog. If not, Stuart, I'll see if I can find the link, but it's out there on the CISA site. It's got a list of all kinds of services. And again, the nice thing about this, it's all free. Go out there, take a look at CISA's website. Don't try and boil the ocean. Identify a few things that might help you get started and start there. And then,
Yes.
To your point, if they want to sign up for the other services, look, it might be a year waiting list, but at least by then, hopefully you've matured enough that you're ready for it.
Well, Steve, you don't have to get it in the next 6 minutes, but if you could get us that sometime later today, when we send a follow-on email to everybody thanking for the people that attended, we can include that link in it as well.
Sure, will do.
On that assessment, we're very fortunate enough. We partner with Security Studio, and they have a very lightweight S2 assessment that allows small businesses to begin to identify, what are the issues they have, how do they go about addressing them, what are the things they need to do. and it's integrated in with the Nodeware output. So the Nodeware output is drives into that assessment instantaneously through our APIs. Any advice for somebody on just kind of getting started on, how do you identify what you have and the problems you need to address on kind of how do you get started, if you will?
No, that's a great question. I would tell you this, from an asset control, and again, this is me being a former CTO. If your IT team can't give you, and I know the answer to this, and I know everyone's going to say, I know we can't, but if you can't tell me what IPs, because you're probably paying for them, but if you can't tell me what IPs and domains externally do you own, you got a problem. Because again, you probably don't own your IP, you're probably renting somewhere, and your domains are probably being hosted, and you have to register them. So all you've got to do is look and say, what are we paying for? Let's start there, because that should be your first kind of look into what you own. Because unless somehow you've been given these IPs and they're all yours, chances are you're paying for something. So I would, believe it or not, I would start with billing and see what are we paying for every year, especially even if it's domain hosting, et cetera, stuff like that. Those aren't bad places to get started. As far as internal asset, again, this is literally where you got to walk around. And I know it's old fashioned, and I know it's a cheesy way, but I'm still, I'm still in the, I love putting tags on everything and tracking everything, and touch every item you own and have a tag on it. I know you're saying, like, are you kidding? But I am telling you, I've been in organizations that don't even do simple things like that, and then they can't figure out why they're buying printers, because they don't even know that they have 5 sitting in the closet in the boxes. So that stuff still happens, and it's just all about being organized. So asset inventories, again, what are you paying for? Start there is a good place, and literally hands-on every device, open up every closet door you have, open up your storage. You would be surprised at what you've bought over the years that's still sitting in the box somewhere. I mean, I know that sounds cheesy, but I just see it too often, and unfortunately, especially in the government.
So we got an interesting question. Can you clarify something? It says you own your own IP if you pay monthly from your ISP.
What I mean is, if you paid someone to get your IP addresses, whether how often you pay.
Right.
So somewhere when you company XYZ decide, hey, we're gonna have our own servers, you went to some internet service provider that gives you your internet service, and you said, hey, listen, maybe it's Verizon Business or AT&T Business, whatever. They're providing you externally facing IP addresses. So your internet service provider should know exactly what IP address is, because you're paying the bill every month for internet access. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's what I mean by that.
Got it. Well, look, we're down to a couple of minutes. I want to thank everybody for attending today. Steve, I'll give you a kind of 30 seconds to collect your thoughts and maybe make a couple of closing remarks at the end. I want to thank everybody for attending today. If you have any additional questions, feel free to put them on our LinkedIn page. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to email us. If you're interested in trying Nodeware, you're more than welcome to do that. We have trials available. We also have promotional programs available through 7-Figure MSP and through ASCII and other MSP and MSSP providers. Plus, we're happy to put you in touch with our network of MSPs. We're happy to matchmake you and connect you to get the local assistance and support you might need if that's where you're at. If you're not there yet, take advantage of the free CISA offerings and get started. Get on the road to cyber hygiene. One last thing, if you get a chance, take a look at. We had a white paper that we did with Tag Cyber, specifically around continuous scanning and how continuous scanning is important as you transition to zero trust, or you're on the path to zero trust. Take a look at that as well. I think you might find that very valuable. And with that, Steve, I'll turn it back over to you. We're at the top of the hour. I'm always concerned about calendar integrity, but if you have a 1-minute wrap up, and then we'll close everything down.
Again, first I want to thank everyone for your time. I do appreciate that, Stuart. Thank you again for the offer. And yeah, my two thoughts are: number one, don't try and do it all at once. You can't. It's not an end state. It's going to be a day-to-day, do a little things. Just keep doing the little things. They will add up. And then the other thing is basically, like, oh, we've got all these things to do. You and every other organization have all of these things to do. Don't let yourself get overwhelmed. Just focus on making small steps at a time, and your organization will be far more secure after 6 months, 8 months, a year, doing little things over time. That will add up, and that will make a difference. So just keep doing something, and you'll get there.
Steve, thanks so much for your time. We'll look forward to having everybody on our next session around Zero Trust. And then, as I said, we'll have a session around insurance, insurance for clients, insurance for MSPs, cyber liability for clients using MSPs. So that'll come up in September. And we have our open demo peer Q&A session that'll come up late in the month as well. So with that, I want to thank everybody for their time today. And we're more than happy to help anybody with any assistance they have, and reach out to CISA as well for any information. As always, if there's a topic or a speaker that you would like us to include in these sessions, if you could let us know that as well, we'll do our best. We continue to have these twice a month as part of our cybersecurity thought leadership program. So I apologize for being a minute over time, but thank you for taking your time today, and we'll see you on our next session. Thanks so much, and if we don't see you, we'll see you on LinkedIn. Bye-bye.